Good morning, everybody. Thanks, Craig and Carol. Craig and Carol actually grew up around the block from where I grew up. You guys didn't grow up there. You were there. I grew up. So, a Hudson connection. Fun. So, this morning, we get to start into Ephesians 2. So, we've been in Ephesians 1. We're now moving to Ephesians 2. And so, over the next couple of weeks, we're going to be talking about Ephesians chapter 2, verses 1 through 10. Which is one of the most beloved passages in Scripture describing what God has done for us in salvation. Except I am not talking about Ephesians 2, 1 through 10. I'm talking about Ephesians 2, 1 through 5. And 1 through 5 includes 1 through 3. And something happened in my neighborhood that reminds me of Ephesians chapter 2, verses 1 through 3 this week. So on Thursday, I was at my house. And I can't remember who else was there. I know Huli was there and my wife was there. But a house, 4 houses down from us, burst into flame. And so we were in our kitchen, and this is like a scene from our driveway. Like I'm standing on my sidewalk and taking a picture of all the smoke. It's hard to kind of do it justice. It was everywhere. My wife was like, "Wow, what's all that fog?" And then Huli's like, "Wait, no, that's not fog. That smells like smoke." And sure enough, 4 houses down was this house that had caught fire. And one thing I never told first service was that everybody was eventually okay. So they all think everything's terrible. But there was like somebody had like some burns because I think it started from a grease fire. But other than that, they were okay. But this was the scene from my yard. And this house, I remember watching it at first, and it took a little while for the firemen to get there. And so I'm like, by the time they got there and after it had been burned, I'm like, there's no way that thing is toast. There's no way that thing's going to be able to be recovered. And it was true. Like, I mean, the house, if you stand 300 yards away from it and look at it and you're not paying attention, you're like, oh yeah, there's a house there. But if you're standing in front of it and looking at it, you're like, oh my gosh, that thing is completely gutted, burnt, beyond hope, dead. And that's what Ephesians 2, 1 through 3 is about, except it's not talking about the house, it's talking about us. That's what the first 3 verses in Ephesians chapter 2 are about. That we, apart from Christ, unredeemed humans apart from Christ, are dead, deluded, domineered, disobedient, and doomed. That's it. That's all the notes I have for this morning. Let's have a good morning. No, but really, that's what it sounds like. So let's read this together. This is, again, Ephesians 2, chapters 1 through 3. I promise there's good news afterwards. But it says, "You were dead in the trespasses and sins in which you once walked, following the course of this world, following the prince of the power of the air, the spirit that is now at work in the sons of disobedience, among whom we all once lived in the passions of our flesh, carrying out the desires of the body and the mind, and were by nature children of wrath like the rest of mankind." It's warm fuzzies all around, warm fuzzies. So let's talk about this. We'll go through this section by section here. It says, Paul writes, "And you were dead." The word dead there is the word nekros, which guess what that means? Yeah, it means dead. It means dead. One that has breathed his last, lifeless, in a spiritual sense, spiritually dead, like a life without meaning, like we are a husk kind of walking around, a shell, but without life inside. That's what this verse describes, is how we are before Jesus, before receiving Jesus. That you may have heard the phrase "dead man walking" is a phrase that sometimes a person who is on death row and is walking to the execution chamber is referred to as a dead man walking. That's sort of the sense of what he's saying here, that we're sort of dead people walking. And we see what's connected to that in what we read next. "You were dead in the trespasses and sins in which you once walked." Okay? Trespasses and sin. These are things that we once walked in, it says. And the word for sins there is the word hamartia. The word hamartia means to miss the mark, is one of the definitions of that. And so I have this picture from, I don't know who drew this, but in our office this week, somebody had drawn that sin is missing the mark. And I didn't draw it, and I didn't talk to anybody about this. It was just funny that somebody had drawn it. I'm like, that's going to be in my sermon. That's cool. It's probably one of you, wasn't it? Was it a, sorry, I didn't mean to call you out. It might have been a Johnson or somebody else in the family. Awesome. So, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to embarrass you guys. But that's the idea, that sin means missing the mark. And if you play a target sport of any kind, basketball or soccer or lacrosse, or if you play disc golf or ball golf, or if you're some kind of a marksman, you know the pain of missing the mark when you want to hit it, right? And so imagine now that your life depends on it, and the mark was perfection, and anything short of perfection misses the mark, and the result is death. So a sports analogy is probably not quite as big in gravity as perhaps this analogy. Here's another analogy to kind of explain this. When Luke Skywalker was tasked to blow up the Death Star, you guys have seen episode 4, hopefully, Star Wars, okay? And he's flying in this trench, and he has to fire photon torpedoes into an exhaust port the size of a womp rat, that then have to travel miles to the core of the Death Star, missing everything between there and then, so that it hits the core and blows up the Death Star. And if he doesn't hit his mark, everybody is dead because the Death Star is going to kill them. That's sort of more of the stakes here. And we have all missed the exhaust port. Sorry. It's my son. We've all missed that shot. We've all missed God's mark of perfection. And I can remember being at Young Life Camp and one of the speakers saying this one time, and this stuck with me because this is like, oh man, I don't like this idea. He said, if you just want evidence that you've missed the mark, or you want to think about, yeah, I've missed the mark, know that God, he said, God sees our thoughts also. And so imagine if someone was able to video record your thoughts for like 2.5 hours during the day. How much would you want that video played for your family and friends like later that night? No one, right? I mean, it's like, oh my, and I remember that hitting me and going, oh man, yeah, okay, yeah, my thoughts, God's, oh gosh, right? We've missed the mark of perfection, and by a mile, right? By a long, long way. So we've missed the mark. That's resulting in our death, which we'll talk about a little bit more in a little bit. But here's the next phrase. So we're dead in our trespasses and sins, in which you once walked, following the course of this world. Okay, the second word there is that we're deluded, that we've been following the course of a fallen world that we were born into. And the word world here isn't just the sense of like that it's the created order, but it's also the system of the fallen world and its systems that we were born into, the attitudes, the habits, the preferences, the patterns that people live in this world today that we were born into and that leaves God out. And it's this world without heaven's touch that we live in now and that we're influenced by and that feels normal to us, right? We're walking in that, and we're not aware even of how much impact the world around us and the negative things in the world have on us because it's what we know. If you're over the age of 20, you've probably heard at least, and maybe if you're under 20, you may have heard the phrase that if you want to know what the water is like, don't ask the fish, right? Because the fish don't know how to describe the water. They're just swimming in it all the time. It's just water. Is it hot, cold? We don't know. It's just water. And there's a sense that it's like that for us. The world that we live in just feels normal. I was doing marriage mentoring this week with a couple, and one of the questions that we asked, so what from your family of origin do you want to bring into your marriage? And then what from your family of origin do you not want to bring with you into your marriage? Which might be an easy question to answer, but for some of us it's hard because it's just what we grew up in. And so we don't even know if there were patterns that were unhealthy sometimes. So for me, I remember this when I was getting close to the point where Jody and I were going to be married. We were getting to know each other. We were hanging out. We kind of knew we were on that course. And so Jody would, she had visited my home and visited my family. And then this was after we were married as well. She came visit. And she said to me one time, she's like, you become like a turtle when you get around your parents. And I'm like, what do you mean a turtle? And she's like, well, it's like your head kind of like goes into your shell and like you just kind of like don't do anything. I hope this isn't what I look like. But like she's like, you don't really do it. You just seem kind of helpless and you just kind of let them do everything for you. Like you don't really offer to help. And I was like, I didn't know that. But apparently, like my parents were so hospitable that they did do a lot of stuff, and I would just kind of sit back and let them do that. And I carried that into my marriage. So in those first few months of marriage, Jody'd be like, so did you think I was going to clean up that mess that you made, right? And I'm like, oh, I don't know. You know, I carried that in with me, right? And for Jody had this thing, and this is just one of the things that she probably brought in from what she was used to in whatever environment she was at before. Sometimes Jody would make these passive aggressive statements and then just like walk out of the room. And so she'd say something like, well, maybe if I thought you actually cared what I said, I'd want to talk to you about that. You'd be like, let's not deal with it that way. Like, that's not how we dealt with it in my house. How about we talk about this and figure out what, let's be direct and talk about this, talk about what we mean. But it was something that she didn't know because that was just how, in some of her environments, she had learned to deal with things. So those are small-scale examples, but also in large-scale ways. We're influenced in how we see life by the fallen world system and systems that we've grown up in and that we're a part of. And there are things in our culture that just feel normal because they're the waters we've been swimming in, but they're not kingdom normal. And they impact us. And so we develop these unhealthy patterns sometimes, and now we're walking in a way that's not what God intended because we've been deluded because we're believing something else, right? So we're deluded. Third thing there is that we're domineered. It's kind of a scary word. But the next passage says that we're following the prince of the power of the air, the spirit that's now at work in those who are disobedient. Ephesians talks a little bit more about this. Who is the prince of the power of the air? Well, Ephesians, Paul writes a little bit more later in this book about the spiritual hierarchy that exists, that there are these spiritual beings that, and many of whom are opposed to God, that are fallen, that are part of this fallen world. And the leader is this prince of the power of the air, as it says. And the power of the air, the idea there is, at the time that Paul wrote this, there was a sense that there was the heavens and there was the earth, and the space in between was sort of the air in between. That was the prince of the power of the air. That there's this prince, this sort of spiritual being that is in charge of that realm that is evil and malevolent. And there's apparently that he has influence over us because of that there's this tyrant. And we see in other places in Ephesians, the Paul calls him the evil one or the devil. That this is a real thing, that there are spiritual influences that are outside of God and other angelic beings and so forth. That there is actual presence of evil beings where we are. And they have influence over us. Jesus, one of the things that Jesus called this evil one was the father of lies. And he said when he lies, he speaks his native language. And so for us, we're under this influence, under this impact. And some of those lies you may hear on a daily basis. And maybe that's just coming because of food you ate last night. Or maybe it's because there is an enemy that wants you to believe those things. So for example, you might hear this lie that no matter what I do, I will never be attractive enough. I will never be good looking enough. My face will never look like that person. And so that is the lie that you're constantly gripped with, that I'm not enough, that I'm not attractive enough. Or maybe you feel like there's this lie, no matter what I do, no matter what I achieve, it's not enough. I could accomplish everything, but it always feels like even when I accomplish something great, I'm not good enough, I'm not enough. And something's zinging that at you. Or maybe there's one thing that you did or something that happened to you, maybe earlier on in life, that you feel like has tainted you and has made you less of a person and shameful. And as much as you want to put it out of your mind and as much as you try to run from it, it just feels like it's always, always there. And it's making you less and you feel disgusting because of it. Okay? Those are 3 examples of lies that may be coming at us from the evil one. Not to mention other systems of oppression we see in the world. From the bully on the playground to the dictator, the oppressive dictator. Somehow the enemy has his hand in those things because it says that he's the ruler of the power of the air, right? The prince, that he's got impact. So now we've got this other thing that's coming against us, right? We're dead, we're deluded, we're domineered, right? And that brings us to the next thing. We're not excused by those things because the next part says, following the prince of the power of the air, the spirit that is now at work in the sons of disobedience, among whom we all once lived in the passions of our flesh, carrying out the desires of the body and the mind. Okay? We're disobedient, according to this passage. The word sons of disobedience, that phrase means that that's like our defining mark apart from Christ. If somebody's called a son of encouragement, like Barnabas is called in Scripture, that means that their defining mark is encouragement. They're so encouraging, it's how they live. But what this says is apart from Christ, our defining mark is disobedience. It's like part of our nature. And who lives that way? Well, according to this, all of us. All of us live that way. And how did we live that way? According to this passage, by just carrying out the desires of our bodies and our minds. And we all have legitimate cravings and needs, but they're distorted, right? By sin, and they lead us down the wrong path. And there's some obvious ways that this plays out. If you turn on the news, you'll see a whole bunch of them. Of just different ways of people hurting other people killing other people. We've also talked in here about the destruction, for example, of pornography, right? Of pornography, of how that is something that is something that gratifies the cravings of the flesh and of the mind, but it is so destructive and so apart from what God has. Or bitterness and anger, that desire to get even that we have that may come because of something that we happen and then emerges from our flesh and how much destruction that causes. Or gossip, right? Where gossip, it feels so good to share that morsel, and yet it's destructive to other people. Or substance abuse and alcoholism. There are all these things that gratify the cravings of our flesh in unhealthy ways. But there's also something else I want to mention, and this is a little bit more subtle, but I think it's really significant in our culture today, and there's this prevailing belief in our culture that the way that we discover who we are is by looking inside ourselves to our deepest, truest feelings about something, right? And that's how we determine what is true of us. And so I'll share just a couple of examples of this in different realms. But this is just sort of a bizarre example because I've just never had this. Nobody's ever said this to me before. It was kind of an interesting conversation. There's a guy that I know at Kroger, and he works in the checkout line. And the one time, we were in the checkout line, and I was talking to him, and I've known him for a little while. And I said, "Hey, how you doing?" And he said, well, I discovered that I'm a polygamist. And I'm like, what? Like it just wasn't something you usually hear in a checkout line, you know? Like I was expecting him to be like, I'm good, you know? But he described what he meant. He just said like, well, I was with this one girl. And living with her, but then I started spending time with this other girl, and I discovered that I really liked her too. And so after doing that, I just determined that must mean that I'm a polygamist. Now, for some of us in here, you might be like, dude, you're cheating on your girlfriend, right? I mean, that's how some people would see that. But he kind of took that and said, okay, this is what this means, and so that he's living that lifestyle now, right? And so. That's an example. Here's another one, okay? You may have heard somebody say something like this. I'm the kind of person who holds grudges, okay? Forgiveness is not a natural craving of the body, right? But so you may have heard somebody that says, I am the kind of person who holds grudges. That I'm pretty nice, but if you get on my bad side, I am not going to forgive you. I'm not going to forgive you. I've heard people tell me that before. And I'm like, oh man, so what does that mean for him? It means that that person, that man or that woman has looked at, that they look inside, and when somebody hurts them, they've determined that they are angry and they don't like that person, and that means, hey, I'm not a forgiving person. I hold grudges, and I'm going to hold it for as long as I want to, right? Like I said, forgiveness is not a natural craving of the body. So somebody may have done something that impacted you. And this is the thing. You may have been impacted by somebody long ago, and it's still impacting your life. Maybe a family member walked out on you and your family, and you were left to pick up those pieces. Or a coach maybe tore you down, and now you don't want to play anymore. Or maybe somebody wasn't paying attention. And this is like a physical thing. Maybe somebody wasn't paying attention while driving, and they hit your car, and you still carry the pain of whatever happened in that accident. Our natural response to those kinds of things is not, I should just forgive them, right? I mean, that's not what our natural body says, and yet that's what God calls us to do. But if I'm following the natural cravings of my body, I might want to get even or get angry, right? One more. Couples. Sometimes couples are having conflict. And I've seen this scenario before. Sometimes a wife might say, or maybe it's the other way around. Maybe the husband says, man, I feel like my wife keeps hurting me with her words. I feel like she's just blunt. And wife says, well, I'm just a really blunt person. And I'm going to tell you like it is. And I mean, if that hurts you, I'm sorry, that's kind of your problem. And if you want me to act different, you're trying to change me into something I'm not. Well, no, sometimes it's not about that. Sometimes we change how we behave because of love. That doesn't mean I'm changing as a person. Does that make sense? But I think some people will use that sort of reasoning to justify an action. And so it's easy to go along with what feels natural inside of us and to carry out the desires of our body and mind. And it feels natural, but this scripture would suggest that following those desires and looking inside isn't necessarily a reliable source of information. That if we allow our desires of our body and mind to dictate our behavior, it may lead us down a darker path. Now, here's the thing, guys. I'm not saying, let me make this caveat. I'm not saying you can't know things about how you're wired by looking at how you respond to things. Like, I think personality tests can be very valuable. The other reality here is, like, we're created in God's image. And so we're all image bearers of God in unique ways. And he's designed us in ways. And so we are different. And it's okay to explore, what does that look like? And what does that mean for me? What does God, a redeemed version of me, look like in this world? I think that's great that we do that. We just have to be careful not to automatically allow what we find inside of us to automatically dictate and justify behaviors that may not be kind or good or healthy. Does that make sense? Okay, so that's the next part there, that we were disobedient. The last is doomed. We were by nature children of wrath like the rest of mankind. Okay? Objects of wrath means worthy of divine judgment. This is the most, I'm so happy I get to talk about this part today. That we're worthy of divine judgment, that God's holy anger is against our sin, and because of that sin pattern and disobedience in our lives, we're all objects of God's wrath, and we're headed for an encounter with that wrath, okay? And we can't just wipe it off or cover it up because it's our nature. And that means that our current relationship with God apart from Christ is hostile, and it carries into eternity. What that means is that there's an eternal separation that we have from God and his blessings. That's what our lives or our works have earned us. Okay? And so we are by nature objects of wrath. Tough stuff, okay? And it looks very bleak. So just to sum up, humans are all in a place that we've missed the mark. The world makes this feel normal. We have all followed our cravings and sin nature. We're all under the influence of a spiritual tyrant ruler. And this all has brought God's wrath, and there's nothing that we can do about it. Just like the house, right? It's beyond repair at this point. That's the bad news, okay? But it doesn't end there, because I also thank God and thank David Newman that I also get to talk about verses 4 and 5. And verses 4 and 5 start with two words, and these two words make up a phrase that David and I were talking this week, and I know he shared this on a number of occasions, that if you wanted to sum up the whole story of the Bible in 2 words, these 2 words might be what you would use. But before I share those 2 words, I think an illustration might be helpful. And I want to talk about my boy over there. Okay, in January 2004, I was living in Monterrey, Mexico with Jody. And this little 9-month-old boy showed up in our lives. And I remember just where he was when I met him the first time. I had walked onto our property, Back to Back's property. And Back to Back, if you don't know, is a ministry that helps kids that are in difficult situations. And so I walked onto our property, and my friend Julie was sitting in the baby rocks, we called them, which was the pea gravel underneath the swing sets that were there. And he was sitting in Huli was sitting in our friend Julie's lap in the baby rocks. And I just remember looking over, and the first thing I noticed was his huge smile. He just had this like huge, massive smile that lit up his whole face. And I was like, man, who's this guy? And she said, this is Huli. His aunt brought him here. His mom wasn't able to take care of him. And so we're trying to find a place for him to stay until we can find a more permanent solution. And I learned that like his mom had been really sick and just not able to care for him and his brother. And we found out at some point in there that that she had lost even a couple of kids, like a couple of babies. And so there was kind of a danger point for Huli that, you know, if he continued in that, maybe he would be in trouble as well. And so, you know, I walked over to the baby rocks to take a turn holding him, and I took him from Julie, and I was instantly shocked because he weighed like nothing. And I was like, oh my gosh. And I came to discover that Huli just was undernourished. Again, his family couldn't feed him adequately. And so he weighed around 12 pounds at 10 months, which if you know anything about babies, that's not very big. And because of some of his difficulties and because he hadn't had a whole lot of other care, he wasn't able to use his legs. In fact, when we took him to the doctor said, well, he may never be able to use his legs. Well, we're like, man. So we said, Jody at this point was 7 months pregnant. So we had a crib and we had a bunch of baby formula and stuff. So we're like, well, why don't we just take him, and we'll take him for a little bit and till we find a more permanent solution. And so he came and stayed in the crib that Isaiah was going to be in, and we started pumping him full of baby formula and baby food. And the first night we had him, he screamed all night until dawn. And when all meaningful opportunities for adult sleep were gone, he was out like a light. It was awesome. Well, a few weeks in, we were like, oh my gosh, we love this kid. And we started to get to know his personality a little bit. He was putting on some weight. He was moving his legs a lot. His legs and his ankles were getting stronger. And his favorite toy was this little plastic fish bowl that had these little spherical fish that he would drop in. And every third fish would make this song happen. And Huli would like dance to the song, and it was cute. And he's the only human, I think, that I've ever known that actually liked when people blew in his face. And he just had this huge belly laugh, which you've heard. That has continued to this day. And so we're like, oh my gosh, how in the world could we ever let this little guy go? We loved him so much. We couldn't bear the thought of him going back to a situation where he might not have his basic needs met. And so we decided to kind of explore, like, hey, would you be open to, or would his mom be open to adoption? And so, so we called his aunt, who we knew, and his aunt called mom and said, hey, there's an American couple that might be interested in talking about adoption. Are you open to that? And Huli's birth mom said, oh man, I can't imagine ever giving my child an adoption. And there's a reason for that. I think a cultural reason, first of all, was that adoption is sort of viewed in a negative light in some ways in Mexico. Partially because people kind of go, well, wait, you had a baby and now you're not gonna take care of this baby? It was really kind of seen as a mark of shame among some people. And number two, it was really hard to do. In fact, the year that we ended up adopting Huli, we were one of 2 international adoptions that entire year. And the other one was our friend that we knew. So, I mean, it just didn't happen very often. And so we're like, so she said, I can't imagine ever giving my child an adoption. The only family that I might consider that it was an American family that I might give an adoption is the family of that one woman who prayed for me at the river that one time last summer. It was Jody, my wife. She was the woman. We had no idea of this, but like 5 months prior, we had gone down to this very humble economically community down by the river to hand out food, clothing, to help out, to pray for people. And while we were there, Jody happened to run into this woman who had 2 young children. And Jody talked with her for a while and then prayed for her, and this woman cried, and no idea that was Huli. No clue, because it was 5 months ago, and he was like 3 months old at that point or whatever. We had no idea that the child that Jody prayed over that day was our future son. And that the only person that woman would consider giving her child to was my wife. It was wild. It was this crazy God moment. And so from there, we decided, we moved forward, and long and short, it was a super long and hard and stressful process because there were so many things that could have gone wrong. But at the end of that, Huli had a birth certificate that had his new name on it. Julian Isaac Massey. Isaac means he laughs. We gave him that name for obvious reasons. And that meant that he had access to our resources. He was not in that danger situation. Again, I want to be careful that we're not blaming the family there. It was very difficult circumstances. We're thankful actually that Juli's been able to connect with some of his birth brothers in recent years, which is super cool. But the point is this, that Huli, in that situation, in that dangerous place he was in, had no power to save himself. It took an act of someone outside of Huli to help get him to safety. And that is the story of God for us. And the 2 words that show this is that we were dead and disobedient and doomed and deluded and all those things. And here's the phrase, but God. But God. But God, being rich in mercy because of his great love with which he loved us, even when we were dead in our trespasses, made us alive together with Christ. By grace you have been saved. God acted because of his great love for us. And that phrase, rich in mercy, means that it's inexhaustible. That it wasn't like he looked down on us and said, wow, they're doing such a great job, I think I'm going to save them out of the mess they're in. No, it was because of his merciful character that he looked and he saw us at our worst. So think about yourself at your worst point that you've ever been at for just a second. That's where God loved you. That his mercy was like, I want that person. He loved us that much. It was his character. It is part of the character of God to show his mercy and love. And he looks at us when we're at our worst. He says, I love you and I want you. If you feel like you don't deserve God's love, you're right. None of us do. But if you feel like you're not valued or valuable, that part you need to push out of your brain. Because you are incredibly valuable to God, and he showed it. Because he sent Jesus to give his life as a ransom to buy us back from that domineering dominion of darkness, to pay the death penalty of doom we owed because of our disobedience, by dying painfully on a cross in our place and paid that ransom, and to make us alive again with him, saving us from death and delusion. And so we can breathe the sigh of relief because it's not by our merit that we're saved, but by his mercy. Next week, you'll hear the specifics of our part because we do have a part, and that's receiving Jesus by faith, this free gift he offers, right? It's this gift he offers. We can respond to his offer of salvation by faith in his son Jesus. Where we end today is understanding that it took an act of someone outside ourselves to save us, and in that we can rest and rejoice. And now, if you're in Christ today, you can say, but God. That we're not chained to the things we used to be chained to, the old identities, the old desires. So we can say, man, that person offended me, and I want to get them back. But God. Or I'm a blunt person. I don't care if I upset people. I'm just going to tell it like it is. But God had grace. I want to have grace. Or I'm just so tempted to do this. But God can help me. Or, oh man, I blew it. I sinned. I'm a failure. Well, hold on. But God, he bought us back from that. He still loves us. Or I feel like I'm ugly, that my body and face will never measure up. No, but God, he saw you. He saw the incredible value in you. Or, I feel like there's this one thing that has tainted me and I'll never be whole because of that thing that happened. Oh, but God, no, he filled in the gaps. And he's continuing to do that. Before we were stuck, but we don't have to be anymore. We don't have to live in that old mindset. Because the story of everyone in this room is you were dead, but God. Right? I think it's fitting that my son, Huli, is a firefighter. He's a first responder. And so when the house caught on fire the other day, his first response was to scramble, run, get all of his firefighter gear, and run out there. He was hoping to beat the fire trucks to get out there because he knows if there's somebody there that needs CPR or there's somebody there that needs pulled out, they may need something outside of themselves to bring them to safety, to bring them to a new life. And that's the heart of the Father for us. But God. So as we go to this time of communion, I just want to encourage you to remember what he has done for us, his mercy toward us. That's why we do communion, right? We do this in remembrance of Jesus, of what he has done for us. Paying our ransom of buying us back from that place of death and doom for all who would place their faith in him. And as you do that, I want to encourage you to think about one other thing. I think this is an important step, that anytime we hear a message from the Lord or that we hear his word, we ask the question, if this is really from God, what am I going to do with what I just heard? What's your I will statement? What do you want to do? I'm going to give you a few possibilities. You don't have to choose one of these, but these are a few, okay? You could say, I will forgive somebody because God forgave me. And the person I'm going to forgive is blank. And I'm going to do that in the next couple of days. Or I will share this passage with someone who needs its message. Or I will replace the phrase, I'm not good enough, with I am valued by God when it comes to mine this month, or this week, next couple days. Or I will thank God 3 different times for his mercy and love in spite of my mistakes. Okay? I don't know which one you want to choose, but I want to encourage you as you thank God in your time of communion to also determine what's one thing, one small step you want to take in response to this word from God's word today that you want to step into. Okay?